Lieutenant James Hartley didn't believe in the Tiger until he saw one blocking the entire road ahead. Its massive 88mm gun swiveling toward his convoy like the eye of some ancient dragon. The morning of June 13th, 1944, had started with tea and optimism. It would end with fire and screaming metal, and the realization that sometimes the monsters are real. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The intelligence briefings had mentioned the Tiger I tank for months, described it as a 60-ton behemoth with armor so thick that standard anti-tank rounds bounced off like pebbles thrown at a castle wall. Most of the crews in the 7th Armored Division, the famed Desert Rats, dismissed these reports as German propaganda designed to break morale before the real fighting even began. After all, they had defeated Rommel's Africa Corps in the desert. They had survived the grinding campaigns through Sicily and Italy. They were veterans, hardened by combat, and they knew that fear was often a more powerful weapon than any gun. James Hartley had joined the Army in 1939 as a fresh-faced clerk from Manchester, believing the war would be over by Christmas. 5 years later, he commanded a troop of Cromwell tanks in a squadron, 4th County of London Yeomanry. His hands bore the scars of hot metal and engine grease, his eyes the distant look of a man who had seen friends burn alive in their tanks. He was 26 years old, but felt ancient. The morning air in Normandy carried the smell of crushed grass and diesel fuel as the British column assembled on the outskirts of Villers-Bocage. The village sat quiet in the early light, its stone buildings untouched by the bombardments that had devastated so many French towns since D-Day. The invasion had been 6 days earlier, and the advance was going better than anyone had dared hope. The planners said they would be in Paris by August, Berlin by Christmas. The optimism was infectious, dangerous in its sweetness. Captain Geoffrey Patterson, commanding the lead squadron, gathered his officers for a final briefing beside his tank. He was a tall man with a neat mustache and the confident bearing of someone who had been born into privilege and had never truly questioned his place in the world. His father was a member of Parliament. His grandfather had commanded a regiment in the Great War. Patterson believed in duty, in the righteousness of their cause, in the inevitable victory of British arms over German barbarism. The plan was simple, perhaps too simple in retrospect. They would push through Villers-Bocage, secure the high ground beyond the village, and open a gap in the German defenses that could be exploited by follow-on forces. Intelligence reported only light resistance, perhaps a few infantry units retreating from the coast. The German army was supposedly in disarray, their vaunted Atlantic wall crumbling under the weight of Allied superiority. No mention of heavy armor, no mention of Tigers. Hartley stood beside his Cromwell, watching his crew perform their final checks. Corporal David Reynolds, his gunner, was a butcher's son from Leeds who could hit a moving target at 800 yards. Private Andrew Clark, the driver, had raced motorcycles before the war and handled the tank with surprising delicacy. Lance Corporal William Foster, the loader, was built like an ox and could maintain a rate of fire that put other crews to shame. The radio operator, young Private Henry Watts, was just 19 and still wrote letters to his mother every week without fail. They were a good crew, one of the best in the squadron. Hartley trusted them with his life, which was fortunate because tank warfare demanded that trust every moment of every engagement. Inside the cramped interior of a Cromwell, you were sealed in a metal coffin with 4 other men, breathing diesel fumes and cordite smoke, knowing that a single well-placed shot could turn your shelter into your crematorium. The column began moving at 0700 hours. 24 tanks of the 4th County of London Yeomanry led the way, followed by a company of motorized infantry from the Rifle Brigade, their half-tracks and trucks loaded with supplies and ammunition. Behind them came more tanks, more infantry, the machinery of modern war grinding forward along a narrow French road lined with hedgerows and apple orchards. Hartley's tank was 5th in line, positioned where he could support the lead elements if they encountered resistance or push forward if they broke through. The Cromwell's engine rumbled beneath him with a familiar vibration that he felt in his bones. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the early mist, revealing a landscape of startling beauty that seemed utterly divorced from the violence that had consumed it. Private Watts's voice crackled over the intercom, reading a message from regiment headquarters. All reconnaissance patrols had reported clear roads ahead. The Germans appeared to be withdrawing toward Caen, abandoning Villers-Bocage without a fight. Patterson's voice came over the squadron net, confident and cheerful, ordering the column to increase speed. They would be in position by noon, he said, well ahead of schedule. The village itself was indeed empty when they entered it. The lead tanks rolled through the narrow streets, their tracks chewing up the cobblestones, turrets traversing left and right in search of targets that did not materialize. A few civilians peered from shuttered windows, but did not emerge. The war had taught the French to stay inside when armies came through, regardless of which flag they flew. Beyond the village, the road climbed a gentle slope through farmland toward a ridgeline called Point 213. The hedgerows grew taller here, ancient boundaries between fields that had stood for centuries. They created natural corridors that channeled the column into a single file, each tank following the one ahead, unable to maneuver or spread out. This was where the trap waited. Michael Wittmann had been waiting since before dawn. The young German tank commander sat in the turret of his Tiger Wannschuh, engine idling quietly, watching the empty road through his binoculars. He was 29 years old and already a legend in the Panzer forces, credited with 138 tank kills on the Eastern Front. His Knight's Cross with oak leaves hung at his throat, awarded personally by Adolf Hitler 3 months earlier. He did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a professional doing his job with excellence. The Tiger beneath him was machine number 207, a 60-ton masterpiece of German engineering that he had commanded for over a year. Its frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick, proof against any Allied tank gun at normal combat ranges. The 88 millimeter main gun, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, could penetrate 140 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. It was not the propaganda monster that Allied intelligence described. It was something more frightening, a real weapon that actually lived up to the myths told about it. Wittmann commanded the 1st Company of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, though at this moment he had only 5 Tigers with him. The rest of the company was scattered across Normandy, trying to respond to the chaos of the invasion. 5 tanks against an entire British column. The mathematics were not favorable, but mathematics had never been the decisive factor in war. Position mattered, surprise mattered. The will to act decisively in the crucial moment mattered most of all. His gunner, Balthazar Wohl, sat below him in the turret, hands resting on the controls for the main gun. Wohl had been with Wittmann since Russia, had survived the hell of Kursk and the nightmare retreat through Ukraine. He knew his commander's methods. The way Wittmann thought about combat as a chess match, where you gave your opponent no time to recover between moves. The loader, Karl Wagner, was newer to the crew, but had proven himself in the fighting around Caen. The driver, Heinz Buchner, could coax surprising speed from the massive Tiger despite its weight. The radio operator, Rudolf Herschel, maintained contact with the other tanks in their small force, positioned in the woods along the ridgeline, invisible from the road below. Wittmann had studied the map all night, working out firing positions and lines of retreat. The narrow road ahead formed a perfect killing ground. Once the British column was committed, strung out in single file beneath the ridge, they would be unable to deploy or maneuver. They would be trapped between the hedgerows, forced to come at him one at a time, or not at all. The first British tank appeared on the road at 08:15 hours. Wittmann recognized it immediately as a Cromwell, faster and more mobile than the older Churchill or Valentine models, but still outgunned and out-armored by the Tiger. He watched through his optics as the column continued to emerge from the village, tank after tank, then half-tracks and trucks loaded with infantry. They were moving quickly, confidently, clearly not expecting resistance. He let them come. Patience was a virtue in an ambush. You waited until the prey was completely committed, completely vulnerable, and then you struck with overwhelming violence. The British column stretched out along the road, 24 tanks visible now, plus dozens of support vehicles. Against any other opponent, it would have been a formidable force. Against Wittmann and his Tigers, positioned perfectly on the high ground, it was a parade moving toward a slaughterhouse. Captain Patterson's tank reached a crossroads where the road to Point 213 branched off to the left. The column began to turn, following the route toward the ridgeline. The lead Cromwell, commanded by Lieutenant Bill Cotton, was 200 meters ahead of the main body, scouting the way forward. Behind Cotton came 3 more tanks in close formation, then Patterson himself, Then the rest of the squadron stretched out over nearly a kilometer of road. Wittmann spoke quietly into his microphone, giving the order to his other 4 Tigers. "Wait for my shot," he said, "then kill everything that moves." He traversed his turret slightly, bringing the main gun to bear on Cotton's Cromwell. The range was 400 meters, almost point blank for the deadly 88. Wohl had the target centered in his sight. Wagner had a shell loaded, the breech closed. The world hung suspended for one perfect moment. Cotton's tank continued forward, oblivious. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and green. Somewhere in the hedgerows, a bird sang. Wittmann gave the order to fire. The Tiger's gun roared, a sound like the end of the world compressed into a single instant. The recoil rocked the entire tank backward. The armor-piercing shell crossed the 400 meters in less than a second, moving at nearly 3,000 feet per second, and struck Cotton's Cromwell on the right side of the turret. The penetration was catastrophic. The shell punched through the armor, detonated inside the crew compartment, and blew the turret completely off the hull. It landed upside down in the road, smoke pouring from the ragged hole where it had been attached. No one got out. Before the echo of the first shot had faded, Wittmann was already traversing to the next target. Wagner had another shell loaded in 4 seconds. The second Cromwell in line tried to reverse, its driver reacting to the sudden destruction ahead, but the narrow road gave him nowhere to go. Wohl fired again. Another hit, another kill. This one brewed up, flames erupting from every hatch as the ammunition inside cooked off. The third and fourth Cromwells attempted to turn their turrets, searching for the unseen attacker, but they were firing blind. Unable to spot the Tiger hole down behind a hedgerow 400 meters away, Wittmann killed them both in the space of 20 seconds, methodical and precise. Each shot was carefully aimed. Each shot found its mark. Hartley heard the shooting before he understood what was happening. The sound of the 88 was distinctive, deeper and more powerful than any Allied tank gun. It rolled down the column like thunder, followed by the crump of secondary explosions as ammunition brewed off inside shattered tanks. Over the radio net, voices began shouting, overlapping, panicked. "Cotton is hit," someone said. "Cotton and Davis both down. We're under fire from the ridge. Unknown enemy force." Patterson's voice cut through the confusion, trying to restore order. "All tanks deploy off the road. Identify targets and engage. Infantry dismount and take cover." But deployment was impossible. The hedgerows formed walls 10 feet high on either side of the road, thick with roots and earth, impassable to the tanks. The only way forward was along the road itself, directly into the teeth of whatever was killing them from the high ground. The only way back was to reverse, turning around in place, an agonizingly slow process that would leave them exposed. Hartley made his decision instantly. "Driver, reverse," he ordered. "Get us back to the village. We're sitting ducks out here." Clark threw the Cromwell into reverse, the engine screaming. The tank began backing down the road, tracks sliding on the cobblestones. Around them, other commanders were making similar decisions, trying to extract their vehicles from the killing zone. The neat column dissolved into chaos as tanks collided with half-tracks. Trucks jackknifed across the road trying to turn around. Infantry jumped from their vehicles and scrambled for cover in the ditches. Wittmann continued firing with mechanical efficiency. His 5th shot killed a Sherman Firefly, the only British tank in the column with a gun powerful enough to threaten a Tiger. His 6th and 7th shots destroyed 2 more Cromwells that had foolishly stopped to return fire, making themselves stationary targets. His 8th shot hit an ammunition truck, which exploded with such force that the blast wave shattered windows in Villers-Bocage nearly a kilometer away. The other 4 Tigers joined the slaughter now, their guns adding to the devastation. Between them, they had perfect fields of fire covering the entire stretch of road. Any tank that moved became a target. Any tank that stopped became a target. There was no good option, no tactical solution to the trap they had driven into. Reynolds, Hartley's gunner, was scanning desperately for targets. "I can't see them, sir," he said, frustration heavy in his voice. "There's smoke everywhere. I can't get a shot." "Keep looking," Hartley replied, though he knew it was futile. The Tigers were hull down, probably in prepared positions, revealing only their turrets when they fired. The Cromwell's 75mm gun was inadequate against the Tiger's frontal armor, even at close range, and at 400 meters, it would be like throwing stones at a fortress. A half-track exploded 50 meters ahead of them, blown apart by a direct hit. Bodies tumbled through the air, ragdoll loose. Hartley's tank swerved around the burning wreckage, still reversing, still trying to reach the illusory safety of the village. The intercom filled with the sound of Reynolds counting off spotted targets, Clark cursing as he navigated backward down a road choked with debris and panic, Foster mechanically loading and reloading even though they had no target to shoot at. Patterson's voice came over the radio, one last time. All units fall back to the village and regroup. We'll establish a defensive perimeter and wait for reinforcements. Then his transmission ended in mid-word, cut off by the sound of tearing metal. Hartley looked back and saw Patterson's tank burning, its turret traversed at an awkward angle, smoke pouring from the hatches. The squadron commander was dead, killed by an enemy he had dismissed as propaganda that morning over tea. The retreat became a rout. Tanks abandoned damaged vehicles and fled on foot. Half-tracks raced back toward Villers-Bocage at suicidal speeds, bouncing over bodies and wreckage. The infantry, caught in the open without cover, suffered terribly. Wittmann's Tigers fired at anything that moved, their guns sweeping the road with methodical precision. In the space of 15 minutes, they destroyed more than 20 British tanks, dozens of trucks and carriers, and killed or wounded hundreds of men. Hartley's Cromwell made it back to the edge of Villers-Bocage and turned down a side street, seeking cover behind the stone buildings. Other survivors gathered there, shocked and disorganized. Officers tried to rally their men, to form some coherent defense. But the psychological impact of the ambush had shattered the unit's cohesion. These were veteran soldiers, men who had faced death before, but they had never encountered anything like the Tiger. Lieutenant Marcus Webb commanded another Cromwell that had escaped the killing zone. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he climbed down from his tank. His gunner was wounded, a piece of shrapnel in his shoulder from a near miss. The loader was in shock, rocking back and forth, mumbling about the 88mm shells that seemed to punch through British armor as easily as knives through butter. Webb found Hartley organizing a defensive position at the eastern end of the village. They set their tanks hull down behind garden walls, infantry deployed in the buildings, anti-tank guns positioned to cover the approaches. It was a hasty defense, but better than nothing. If the Germans pressed their attack, if those Tigers came into the village, it would be close-range street fighting where British numbers might offset German qualitative superiority. But the Tigers did not come. Wittmann was too professional to throw away his advantage by entering an urban environment where his long-range gun and heavy armor would matter less. He had accomplished his mission, stopped the British advance, inflicted devastating casualties. Now he would hold the ridge and wait for reinforcements. Let the Allies worry about what other nightmares might be lurking in the Norman hedgerows. The British waited too, but they waited in fear. Word of the ambush spread through the division like wildfire. The desert rats, who had never retreated from Rommel, had been stopped cold by a handful of tanks. The Tiger was real, the myths were true, and somewhere out there in the French countryside, more of them were waiting. Hartley sat on the hull of his Cromwell, smoking a cigarette with trembling fingers. His crew gathered around him, equally shaken. They had survived, but only through luck and Clark's quick driving. A few seconds slower, and they would be cooking off like Patterson's tank, like Cotton's, like all the others still burning on the road outside the village. Reynolds broke the silence. "Sir, what the hell was that thing?" Hartley took a long drag on his cigarette, watching the smoke curl up toward the blue Norman sky. "That was a Tiger," he said quietly. "That was what they tried to tell us about in the briefings, and we didn't believe them." The implications settled over the group like a shroud. If the intelligence about the Tigers had been accurate, what else had been accurate that they had dismissed? How many more of these monsters were waiting in the hedgerows? How were they supposed to fight something that could kill them from 400 meters away, while remaining effectively immune to return fire? Webb joined them, having posted sentries and organized a casualty collection point. His hands had stopped shaking, but his eyes still held the hollow look of a man who had seen his certainties destroyed. He accepted a cigarette from Hartley, lit it, smoked in silence for a moment. "We lost half the squadron," Webb finally said. "Half, in 15 minutes. Against what? 5 tanks? Maybe 6? The mathematics don't work. We can't win if those are the exchange rates." Hartley nodded slowly. "We can't win by fighting them the way we fought in the desert," he agreed. "We need new tactics, new weapons. Or we need to avoid them entirely and let the Air Force handle them." But they both knew that was fantasy. The Air Force could not be everywhere. The Tigers could appear anywhere, anytime, and when they did appear, British tank crews would die in their metal coffins, while their families back home believed they were winning the war. Throughout the afternoon, British reinforcements arrived in Villers-Bocage. Infantry from the Rifle Brigade fortified the village. Artillery batteries deployed in the fields beyond. Their guns ranged on the ridge where Wittmann waited. Tank destroyers with 17-pounder guns, the only weapon in the British inventory that could reliably penetrate Tiger armor, moved into position. The desert rats licked their wounds and prepared to defend what they had failed to capture. Wittmann watched the buildup through his optics, counting units, estimating strength. He had bought time for the German defenses around Caen, delayed the British timetable by at least a day, possibly more. His Tigers had suffered no losses, fired perhaps 50 shells total, and changed the psychological balance of the campaign. From this moment forward, every British tanker would hesitate when entering a new sector, would scan the hedgerows for the distinctive shape of a tiger, would know that the monster was real. He did not celebrate. Celebration was for amateurs. He simply lit a cigarette, shared schnapps with his crew, and began planning how to extract his tanks before the British recovered enough to counterattack with overwhelming force. The victory had been complete, but it was also temporary. The Allies had endless reserves, could afford to lose 50 tanks and replace them within days. Germany could not. Every Tiger was precious, irreplaceable. His job was to use them perfectly, to make each shot count, to survive so he could fight tomorrow. As the sun set over Villers-Bocage, both sides settled into an uneasy standoff. The British held the village, the Germans held the ridge. Between them lay a road littered with burning tanks and dead men. A road that had been a highway to victory that morning and had become a graveyard by afternoon. Hartley stood watch that night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. Every sound made him flinch. Every shadow might conceal a tiger. He was not afraid exactly. He had been in combat too long for simple fear, but he was newly aware of his own mortality in a way that years of war had somehow not quite driven home. The Cromwell that had felt like a fortress that morning now felt like a death trap. The confidence that had carried him through Africa and Italy had been replaced by a grim understanding that skill and courage were not enough against certain kinds of technology. Webb found him in the early hours, unable to sleep either. They shared the last of Hartley's cigarettes, watching the dark silhouette of the ridge where the Tigers waited. Neither man spoke for a long time. There was nothing to say that would change the mathematics of the situation. Finally, as false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Webb said what they were both thinking. "We're going to lose a lot more men before this is over, a lot more, and some of us won't see England again." Hartley nodded slowly. "But we'll still win," he said, though his voice held more determination than conviction. "We'll win because we have to, because the alternative is unthinkable." Webb stubbed out his cigarette. "I hope you're right. I hope those tigers are as rare as intelligence says, because if there are many more where that one came from, we're in for a very long summer." They were both right. The British would win, eventually, through weight of numbers and industrial superiority, and the simple fact that Germany was fighting a war on multiple fronts that it could not sustain. But the summer of 1944 would indeed be long and bloody, measured in burning tanks and shattered lives, in the slow advance through Normandy hedgerow by hedgerow, village by village, against an enemy that refused to accept defeat, even when defeat was inevitable. The Battle of Villers-Bocage ended the next day when British forces withdrew to consolidate their lines and the Germans, outnumbered and threatened with encirclement, pulled back toward Caen. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides were partially correct. The British had failed to break through. The Germans had failed to throw the Allies back into the sea. The stalemate would continue for another 6 weeks, before the breakout at Falaise finally shattered the German front. But something had changed on that road outside Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944. The Tiger had gone from rumor to reality, from propaganda to nightmare. British tankers who had dismissed the intelligence reports now believed them completely. The psychological impact of Wittmann's ambush rippled through the entire Allied army, creating a mystique around the Tiger that actually exceeded its real capabilities. Fear is a weapon, sometimes more effective than any gun, and Wittmann had wielded it perfectly. Michael Wittmann did not survive the war. He was killed 2 months later near Falaise, his Tiger destroyed by rocket-firing aircraft, though some accounts say it was Canadian tanks that finally caught him. He was 30 years old. The German propaganda machine made him a hero, the ideal of Aryan warrior excellence, though Wittmann himself had been uncomfortable with the attention. He had simply been a soldier doing his job with extraordinary skill, and he died as soldiers die, violently and young, in a war that devoured men and machines with equal appetite. James Hartley survived. He fought through France and Belgium, crossed the Rhine into Germany itself, and was in Bremen when the war ended in May 1945. He never forgot that morning in Villers-Bocage, never forgot the sound of the 88mm gun, never forgot watching tanks explode one after another while he reversed down a road choked with burning vehicles and screaming men. The memory shaped him, made him cautious when caution was warranted, aggressive when aggression was required. He became a better officer because he had learned that technology mattered, that preparation mattered, that dismissing intelligence reports because they seemed implausible was a luxury that got men killed. He returned to Manchester after the war, married his sweetheart Margaret, who had waited 6 years for him, had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. He worked as a mechanical engineer, designing heavy machinery, and never spoke about the war, except once when his grandson asked him directly if he had been afraid. Hartley had thought about the question for a long time before answering. Yes, he had finally said, I was afraid. Anyone who says they weren't afraid is either lying or insane. But fear wasn't the problem. Fear kept you sharp, kept you alive. The problem was when fear paralyzed you, when it stopped you from doing what needed to be done. And on that day at Villers-Bocage, when we faced something that intelligence had warned us about and we had dismissed, fear taught me the most important lesson of the war. The lesson that the monsters are sometimes real, and the price of underestimating your enemy is paid in blood. The Tigers remained a threat for the rest of the war, but never again achieved the devastating success of that June morning. Allied forces adapted, developed tactics to deal with them, brought up heavier guns and more powerful tanks. The British Churchill, equipped with the 17-pounder gun, could fight a Tiger on relatively equal terms. The American Sherman Firefly, similarly armed, gave platoons the ability to deal with heavy German armor. Rocket-firing aircraft like the Typhoon learned to hunt Tigers from above, where their armor was thinnest. Intelligence improved, reconnaissance identified Tiger units before they could set ambushes. Artillery plastered suspected positions with overwhelming firepower. But the psychological damage was done. For the rest of the Normandy campaign and beyond, Allied tankers approached every engagement with the knowledge that a Tiger might be waiting, hull down behind a hedgerow or hidden in a tree line, its deadly 88 ready to kill them before they even saw their enemy. That knowledge, that fear, was perhaps Wittmann's greatest legacy, more enduring than any single battle, any number of tank kills. The wreckage of Villers-Bocage was cleared in the weeks following the battle. The burned-out tanks were salvaged for parts or hauled away to scrapyards. The dead were buried, British in one cemetery, German in another, separated in death, as they had been separated in life by ideology and nation. The village was rebuilt after the war, its stone buildings repaired, its streets repaved. Today, a small museum commemorates the battle, displays photographs and maps and personal effects. Tourists visit, mostly British, drawn by the story of the desert rats and their encounter with the legendary Tiger. Very few of them understand what really happened there. They see the numbers, 24 tanks destroyed, hundreds of casualties, and they reduce it to statistics. But statistics cannot capture the terror of being trapped on a narrow road while an unseen enemy methodically destroys your unit. Statistics cannot convey the sound of men screaming as their tanks burn, the smell of diesel fuel and cooked flesh, the sight of a turret blown 50 feet into the air by an ammunition explosion. Statistics are clean and abstract. War is anything but. The Tiger itself has become a symbol, arguably the most famous tank of World War II, celebrated in movies and documentaries and video games. Its silhouette is instantly recognizable, its reputation as the ultimate predator of the battlefield secure in popular imagination. But that reputation was built on mornings like Villers-Bocage, built on the fear and blood of men like Cotton and Patterson, and the dozens of others who died on that road, built on the trauma experienced by survivors like Hartley and Webb, who carried those memories for the rest of their lives. In the end, the question is not whether the Tiger was as good as the myths claimed. The question is, what happens when men go into battle believing their enemy's weapons are propaganda, only to discover that sometimes propaganda is simply the truth delivered prematurely? The British crews who drove down that road on June 13th, 1944 had believed themselves superior, believed their experience and courage would overcome any technical disadvantage. They learned differently in the span of 15 minutes, learned it in the most brutal way possible. That was the real lesson of Villers-Bocage, not that tigers were unstoppable, they were not, but that underestimating your enemy could turn a confident advance into a bloodbath, could transform professional soldiers into panicked refugees, could make the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. Intelligence had warned them. Experience from the Eastern Front had warned them. But warnings mean nothing if you do not believe them. If you convince yourself that surely the reports must be exaggerated, surely our equipment is good enough, surely our skill will prevail. James Hartley learned to believe the warnings. He learned to respect his enemy's capabilities even when they seemed impossible. He learned that confidence was valuable, but humility was essential. And he learned that sometimes survival came down to luck, and a driver with quick reflexes rather than any virtue or skill on your own part. These were hard lessons, paid for with the lives of better men than himself, or so he always felt. He died in 2003 at the age of 85, surrounded by family, having lived the long, peaceful life that Patterson and Cotton and so many others had been denied. His grandson asked him once more about the war near the end, asked if he regretted his service, if he thought it had all been worth it. Hartley had smiled. That distant smile of someone looking back across decades at a younger version of himself, and said simply that he had done what needed doing when it needed doing, and that the alternative, the world where men like him had not been willing to face the tigers, both literal and metaphorical, was not a world he wanted his grandchildren to inherit. The road outside Villers-Bocage is quiet now, peaceful farmland where tourists stop to take photographs and study historical markers. The hedgerows remain, though they have grown and changed in 80 years. If you know where to look, you can still see the scarring on some of the trees, marks left by shellfire and shrapnel, though time has softened and covered most of the evidence. The past is always present if you know how to read the landscape. If you understand that history is not something that happened in books, but something that happened to real people in real places. And sometimes, late at night, if you stand on that road and listen carefully, you might almost hear the echo of that 88mm gun, the sound that transformed myth into nightmare, propaganda into truth, confidence into terror. You might almost see the shadow of a tiger waiting hull down behind a hedgerow that no longer exists, its gun traversing toward targets that turned to ash 80 years ago. You might almost understand what those men experienced when they learned that sometimes the monsters are real, and sometimes the only thing that saves you is luck and the desperate skill of a driver throwing his tank into reverse while the world explodes around him. That is the story of Villers-Bocage, the story of the day the tiger stopped being a rumor and became the nightmare that would haunt Allied tankers for the rest of the war. It is a story told in burning metal and broken bodies, in fear and courage and the terrible randomness of survival. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not for the glory of it, there was no glory, but for the truth of it, the hard lesson that pride and overconfidence can kill you just as surely as any enemy shell, and that intelligence ignored is intelligence wasted.